Now on Eye on Politics, Governor Abbott in Fort Worth, he says he's fully committed to teacher pay raises. But when could lawmakers take up that issue? Ken Paxton in court. The impeached and suspended Attorney General appeared in a Houston courtroom in his state securities fraud case. What's next for this case that's now in its 8th year after a series of delays? And one-on-one, we speak with North Texas Congressman Jake Ellzey and former Texas Secretary of State John Scott, who just wrapped up his time as interim Texas Attorney General. I'm Jack Fink. Get your fix for Texas politics. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas starts right now. Hello and welcome. We begin with impeached and suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton, who was in a Houston courtroom Thursday for his state securities fraud case that's now in its 8th year after a series of delays. And attorneys on both sides said the upcoming impeachment trial in the Texas Senate will have a big impact on his criminal case. The criminal case returns to the Harris County courtroom for a hearing October 6th. Now to Governor Greg Abbott's visit to Fort Worth this week. He told me he backs salary increases for Texas teachers and that it may be on the agenda for a 3rd special session he calls sometime this fall. Both House Speaker Dade Phelan and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick recently told me they support pay raises for teachers. There's about $5 billion additional dollars set aside for public education in the recently approved state budget. Much of that money could go towards salary increases for teachers. The governor said funding for public schools and per student is at an all-time high. Abbott has also pushed lawmakers to pass taxpayer-funded education savings accounts, or ESAs, to allow some students to attend private schools. Attempts to tie both the teacher pay raises and the ESAs together failed in the House. I asked the governor about both.
Yes, I am fully committed to putting forth legislation that will even add more to teacher pay raises in the state of Texas, and that may be one of the items that will be on the next special session agenda.
Will it be separate from education savings accounts?
All the nuances of that will come out at the time that the agenda is issued.
Governor Abbott came to Fort Worth for a ceremonial bill signing on legislation approved by lawmakers to crack down on illegal street racing and street takeovers. Teachers we spoke with last week said they were very disappointed that the state legislature hasn't yet approved pay raises. Some districts have increased teacher salaries, and some lawmakers have said that it's up to the school boards to provide those, not the state. While the governor hasn't specified a date for a 3rd special session, we know it will take place after the Senate impeachment trial. That begins on September 5th and could take several weeks. Abbott also spoke about the Biden administration's lawsuit against the state's buoy barrier in the Rio Grande, designed to keep migrants from illegally crossing into Texas. In its lawsuit, the Biden administration says the buoy violates the Rivers and Harbors Act, which prohibits the creation of any obstruction not approved by Congress. The governor, though, said the president should send him a thank you note for Texas's efforts to secure the border, which has cost state taxpayers billions of dollars. Abbott said he doesn't think the federal statute applies to the buoys.
But second, even if it does, I believe that the constitutional right of the state of Texas to secure our border and to defend our sovereignty supersedes any statute. And that is, I cannot predict what may happen in a trial court. What I can tell you for certainty is that Texas is going to take this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
Logically, if he's impeached in the Senate, he would have greater motivation to resolve this case on whatever basis, because his political career, one would think, would be dead.
Ken Paxton, who remains suspended, didn't say anything to the judge in court, but has denied wrongdoing in the impeachment and state cases against him. He was able to enter and leave the courtroom through an inside door to avoid reporters. Paxton faces 2 first-degree felonies for securities fraud and a 3rd-degree felony for failing to register with state regulators, allegations from before he was elected Attorney General. The case, which began in Collin County, where Paxton is from, has been delayed for years on a variety of appeals and is now staying in Harris County.
No one's above the law, and that while the wheels of justice may have appeared to move with glacial pace in this case, I think we're about to pick up speed.
Still to be resolved, back pay for the special prosecutors. For now, Paxton's attorneys say he's focused on his impeachment trial.
And he's doing his job, helping us get ready for trial, meeting with fundraisers and supporters, and just going through it.
In his impeachment case, Paxton's lawyers want 19 of the 20 articles against him dropped, with the only exception relating to the whistleblowers in his office who first brought allegations of bribery to the FBI.
This business about whistleblowers and settling litigation is newer. That carries over into the current term. And okay, that's fair. You guys can consider that, Senate, if you want to. But everything the voters dealt with, that's history. And it's something that ought not be taken up by the Senate.
The remains of a migrant were recovered Wednesday from the buoys, and now we are waiting to see if a judge requires the state to temporarily remove the buoy barrier before the case gets to trial. In headlines across North Texas and the state, the North Texas Job Fair is going to be taking place on Monday at the Irving Convention Center. There are about 340 businesses offering a total of 11,000 jobs. It's a bipartisan event, and it's being organized by North Texas Congresswoman Beth Van Dyne.
And what I keep hearing from all of these businesses is they are desperate to hire people. And what I hear from other people that are looking for jobs, they're looking for new careers, they're looking for advancement, they're looking for higher pay, is they want to know the best way to do it. So what we've done is we've responded very pragmatically. We've put together another job fair. And these are from every industry imaginable, from healthcare, technology, financial services, energy sector, aviation, transportation, hospitality. And we're really excited about it. 11,000 positions, all under the same roof.
The job fair is free for anyone to attend. It's Monday, August 7th at the Irving Convention Center from 11 a.m. until 3 p.m. The ACLU has filed suit against the state of Texas to block Senate Bill 12 from taking effect September 1st. The law prohibits anyone younger than 18 from attending a sexual-oriented performance, including drag shows. The group Texas Values criticized the lawsuit. The ACLU says the state law violates the First and 14th Amendments. Now to two stories involving the leading presidential candidates for next year, President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. The former president appeared in federal court in Washington, D.C. Thursday after being indicted on criminal charges for his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election and his role in the attack on the U.S. Capitol January 6th. CBS News correspondent Robert Costa reports.
According to the indictment, for more than 2 months following Election Day, the defendant spread lies that there was fraud in the election and he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false.
The former president was also charged with impeding the January 6 congressional proceeding where the 2020 election outcome was to be verified and led to the storming of the Capitol by Trump supporters.
Sources tell CBS News former President Trump's legal team is now mapping out a new strategy to push back on the charges, shifting blame onto lawyers who were advising him at the time of the aftermath of the 2020 election. In a recent social media post, Trump noted his attorneys met with the Department of Justice, saying they explained in detail that I did nothing wrong and was advised by many lawyers. Sources say the strategy could involve trying to pin blame on John Eastman, Trump's former lawyer, who sought to have former Vice President Mike Pence refuse to certify the 2020 election results, and presented Trump with a memo outlining a plan to do so. Trump has privately told allies that he believed John Eastman's plan came from a conservative lawyer, and that following Eastman's counsel does not mean he conspired against the United States. But those familiar with the special counsel's work say Trump's conduct is being deeply investigated, and that prosecutors are skeptical that Trump was just following advice.
Robert Costa, CBS News, Washington.
For his part, former President Trump called the special prosecutor, Jack Smith, deranged and said the indictment against him is election interference. Now to the case involving President Biden's son, Hunter. The The U.S. House Oversight Committee, led by Republicans, interviewed Hunter Biden's former business partner, Devon Archer, to see if there were any connections to the president. CBS News correspondent Catherine Herridge reports on the behind-closed-doors testimony.
Hunter Biden left the federal courthouse in Wilmington after the plea agreement reached with prosecutors last month collapsed. The president's son was expected to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges and was expected to enter a diversion program to resolve a 3rd charge for felony gun possession. But Trump-appointed judge Mary Ellen Noreika's questions about the scope and structure of the agreement ultimately led to it unraveling. The critical disagreement between U.S. Attorney David Weiss, a Trump appointee, and Hunter Biden's legal team is over whether the plea would close the door on future charges for other possible crimes. Weiss has said consistently the probe is ongoing. Judge Noreika said she felt she was being asked to rubber stamp an agreement she had concerns about and questioned if the resolution to the gun charge was even constitutional. The White House reiterated the president's support for his son, but stressed the independence of the Justice Department. Republicans have criticized the plea agreement, calling it a sweetheart deal.
Hunter Biden left the courthouse behind me without commenting. For reporters, he's entered a plea of not guilty for now. A plea agreement is still possible. The parties have 30 days to answer the judge's questions before she makes a decision. Catherine Herridge, CBS News, Wilmington, Delaware.
Coming up, not one, but 2 one-on-one interviews. We spoke with former Texas Secretary of State John Scott, who just completed his job as interim Texas Attorney General. But first, our interview with North Texas Congressman Jake Ellzey about the economy and his recent trips to Israel and Ukraine. Welcome back. North Texas Congressman Jake Ellzey of Waxahachie just returned from his visit to Israel. We spoke with him about that, plus his trip to the Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you, you just got back from Israel, and I wanted to know what the highlights were for you on this trip and why it was so important for you to go.
Jack, it's great to be with you. The trip to Israel was a life-changing event for both me and my wife. We went on a bipartisan group of congressmen and spouses or significant others. One guy brought his daughter, members of the House Armed Services Committee or veterans. And it was a mix of both cultural and historic religious sites and military sites. And as a 20-year naval aviator, I had flown over Israel in 2001 before 9/11, and I recognized just how small that country was, and in a very short amount of time, you reach the other border. So I view things from the lens of a military man, and it's remarkable how small that nation is and how surrounded they are by folks who don't believe that Israel has a right to exist. So we met with local leaders, we met with governmental leaders, we met with Netanyahu and the opposition leader, we met with the director of the Mossad, the chief of staff of the armed forces, the minister of defense, and a whole lot of folks who are involved in the defense of Israel. So we got a really good, clear look at the threats that Israel faces on a daily basis. My wife said she felt very much at home there, and I will tell you that it was a beautiful country. We stayed in Jerusalem for 5 nights, and there's nothing quite like watching the sunrise in Jerusalem with the smell of honeysuckle. It was a wonderful trip.
And you said you met with the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is a controversial figure on the world stage, even in Israel. And so I'm wondering, what did you discuss with him?
We discussed the defense of Israel, our ties with the United States, and I will tell you this, it wouldn't matter which side of the aisle they are in the Knesset, which is their legislature. They all wanted to say thank you to the United States of America and our people for helping them defend themselves as the only democracy in the Middle East. So it was their friendship with us is absolutely ironclad. However, Netanyahu said something that really stuck out for me, and he said, in essence, alliances are great, but at the end of the day, I have to defend the people of Israel. And so that was a very clear marker for him that if somebody who's a friend decides to go the other direction, that would leave Israel vulnerable, he and his team will take care of it themselves. And I found that to be striking.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Anybody comes to Texas, we have the same idea. So as Texans, as native Texans who was a republic and then a state, and as Americans, I think we all agree with that. But if you look at the map of Israel, within their own borders, they have known terrorist organizations that have 130,000 missiles pointed at the interior of Israel. And I think if we had that problem here, and we'll discuss the map here in just a minute, if we had that problem here, we'd probably live our lives with a few different priorities.
You talk, a little bit about what the Prime Minister said, and what comes to my mind is the Iran nuclear deal and the fact that the Biden administration is working on that, trying to revive it after it was rejected by former President Trump. And so what's your thought about this? And I'm sure the Prime Minister told you and your group that he opposes that.
Oh, absolutely he did, but I don't think that there's anybody who agrees with that on either side of the aisle in Israel. Nor do I think,
Congress don't like it.
I think neither in Congress nor in the Knesset. And so I'm not sure who it is that's trying to push a new nuclear deal, but if you think about Hamas and Hezbollah being funded by Iran that threaten Israel's very existence, and then somebody wanting to do another deal, and then the last one wasn't good. And I think all parties agree with that. Iran is the number one proponent of terrorism throughout the world. They do not believe Israel has a right to exist. They've been pursuing nuclear weapons, and we keep deciding to play this game. Additionally, constitutionally, there's no such thing as a deal. There's either a treaty or there's not. And I think the constitutionality of the Obama administration's action on a deal in the first place could be argued in the courts that it should never have been accomplished. So I'm completely opposed to it, and I know most of the folks on the other side of the aisle are too.
And the fact that it wasn't a treaty was why Trump was able to undo it.
That's correct.
I wanted to ask you about, just because you talked about flying over Israel, and so you could see how small it is. We'll get to the map, but how should people here in North Texas view it as far as the fact that it is still surrounded by a lot of people who don't like Israel? Now, obviously, Egypt and Jordan have peace with Israel, but still, when you consider how small it is, and you've got Lebanon, you've got Hezbollah and Iran. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, when you stand on a skyscraper in Tel Aviv and you can see the Jordan Valley and recognize that that's the border with Jordan, and that's where, if Jordan were to fall, that's where the threats would come from. We don't really have that kind of appreciation, especially here in Texas, in a very big state, of how small that area is. I flew over Israel in about 3 minutes, and then I had to turn before I went into the border with Jordan. So to put it in perspective for folks out here, imagine if the people of Plano had 130,000 rockets and missiles, and they decided that the people of Waxahachie didn't have a right to exist. That's the distance from the Gaza Strip to Tel Aviv. It's half that from the Lebanon border to Haifa. We went to a little town just outside of Gaza that has 30 seconds to respond if there's missiles launched. And missiles have been launched on a town called Sderot. That town has 30 seconds to respond. Every house must be built with a bomb shelter in it. So that makes Maslow's hierarchy of needs vastly different than what we have to deal with here. But when you have 30 seconds to respond, imagine if you're here in Texas and you had 30 seconds to respond. We're in a building like this, where do you go? So that puts in mind differences, which is, I think, we have the ability to worry about social issues here in the United States. On both sides of the aisle in the Knesset, it's about national security. They don't really deal with many social issues over there because it's all about continuing to live and exist.
I did want to ask you two other questions about Israel. One was in the headlines now about Israel and Saudi Arabia potentially coming to some mutual understanding and a peace agreement. What do you make of that?
Well, I think they've been trying to get Saudi Arabia to become a part of the Abraham Accords. I think that would be very valuable in light of the fact that just a few months ago, Iran and Saudi Arabia had a meeting, which I think unsettled a whole lot of folks. So I think we need to finalize the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia to ensure that everybody's on the same page about Israel and its security in the Middle East. So it was, when part of the trip we went to Yad Vashem. which is the Holocaust Museum in Israel. We must never forget that the Israeli people, the Jewish people, for 2 millennia were searching for a home, and they finally found it. And now that there's actually folks who don't believe that they have a right to exist, we need to be pushing those folks out, because the understanding is that any people don't have the right to exist in the 21st century is mind-blowing to me. And that's why when it comes to Ukraine as well, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, it doesn't exactly mirror what has happened to the Jewish people over time, but it does mirror it and parallel it.
I do want to ask you about that. I did have another question just about Israel, because recently the president, Herzog, came and spoke before Congress and really pushed back on some of the members. There was one member, Jayapal, if I have her pronunciation correctly, who called Israel an apartheid state. What was your reaction when you heard that?
The same thing that 420 other Congress members did, and there's only 222 Republicans. So everybody was repulsed by that. She got pushed back on it. She retracted it. And we had and August Pfluger from Texas had a resolution saying, no, that is absolute nonsense, and we need to be pushing back on that. But in today's society, with 24-hour news, with Twitter, with the algorithm, you can say almost anything that's crazy in office, and you're going to get that broadcast all over the place, because that's what makes money apparently these days, is saying outrageous things. But I want to just encourage people, certainly in this listening area, that there's a lot of folks who are just doing the job on behalf of the American people and aren't interested in saying things like that. So she gets attention from that, but she also got repudiated by her own party for that.
And my last question really on Israel was, as far as the whole controversy over the power of the judiciary there and the reforms that the Prime Minister has put in place. Not fully yet, but it's really drawn a lot of concern, some controversy, not only in Israel, obviously, where they've had these threats of strikes and vast rallies, et cetera, against it. What did you make of that? And what are your concerns about it, if any?
Well, I think it's very easy for us as Americans to look at other governments through our lens and make the same comparison and go, well, I don't understand why they would do something like that. There is no constitution in Israel, and currently judges pick their own. There is no advice and consent in the Senate. They pick their own. There is an amount of, and they have the ability to override any laws that they deem extreme in Israel. So their setup is different than ours, and I think that making the branches more equal is a good thing from my perspective as an American who says the Supreme Court and Congress and the executive branch are equal. They don't currently have that in Israel, so trying to level the playing field, I think, is perfectly reasonable, and the Knesset has deemed so as well. We get things passed with a small majority here, and that's what they did there too, but outside influences causing protests there are something that you're going to see as well, because there are groups out there, there are folks with money out there, other nations who want to destabilize Israel, and by paying for protests over there, that is a good way to do it.
And that's what's happening.
That is what I have heard from when we had those meetings over there, that the intelligence folks would say there's outside money coming in to fund these protests. And it does show the world a less than stable Israel, which is not the true story. But for their purposes, it does help degrade the opinion of Israel in other people's eyes.
You brought up Ukraine before, and obviously you were there earlier this year, right after President Biden was there. And I'm wondering from you, how is this war going?
First of all, I don't call it a war. I know it is an invasion, but I call it a genocide. And the reason for that is, by definition, when you start exporting children of one country to another to re-educate them, that is the definition of genocide. And depending on the official numbers of somewhere around 20,000 to the unofficial number of 200,000, especially in light of watching Sound of Freedom, imagine your children being exported to another country to be re-educated, stolen by the Russian people and sent elsewhere to erase the Ukrainian people's history. I'm a student of history, and I recall in the 30s that Stalin killed 8 million Ukrainians through starvation in order to wipe out the society. And Putin has been acknowledged as being a neo-Stalinist in wanting to take back Ukraine and wipe out that history. Having said that, the borders of Ukraine, internationally recognized, include Crimea. So when Putin invaded and the media called it an annexation in 2014, that was the start of this war. You don't just get to annex somebody else's property or land or borders. And so the Ukrainians are fighting back for their homeland. They've got the spring offensive going on right now. They hadn't fully committed until very recently their troops, and they're making slow progress. But the Russians had 8 years to fortify with trenches and other defensive positions the whole of the eastern and southern front. So this is going to be a long slog, not unlike World War I. But with the proper weapons and proper training, which the Ukrainians have Western training and now Western weapons, they're making progress. I will say that the United States needs to send ATACMS. The launchers they already have, the range is 3 times greater than that which they have right now with 500-pound warheads. We should have been giving them a long time ago.
I was going to ask you about that. Has the U.S. help been too slow?
I think as Western Europe has started to ramp up their aid, the United States, for various reasons of this administration, we authorize the amount of money. The administration has chosen not to send some weapons, particularly the ATACMS. And if you'll ask Chairman McCall about this, another Texan, he will tell you that there's enough ATACMS, and the administration will tell you that there aren't. But there are. But it does also tell us that we need to ramp up our industrial base here to prepare for the enemies overseas that we see everywhere. In fact, North Korea, Russia, and China just had a meeting in North Korea. We need to be ever present and in the moment, understanding that the world does have enemies, and they look a lot like they did in 1938.
And I was going to ask you, why is this issue so important to you? Are we on the cusp of what the axis you just referred to, China and North Korea, Iran, etc., Russia?
In 1947, Winston Churchill, right after they had lied with the Soviet Union to win World War II, he came to Missouri with Harry S. Truman, then the president, and he said the only thing the Russian understands is force. That's the only thing he understands. And he said that over 75 years ago.
And nothing's changed?
And nothing's changed. So Putin has turned his nation into an oligarchy, and he has invaded a sovereign nation, and he's going in total war. He is not bombing military sites, he's bombing residential centers, he's bombing churches, and he's stealing the children to re-educate them in Russia. This isn't a war, this is a genocide. And on a moral basis alone, how can you say that, no, we can't support Ukraine for this reason or that reason? I don't believe that. This is where force needs to be met with strength, and as a moral nation, we need to do so. We have aided other nations in the past for a lot less provocation than we are with Ukraine. As a military man, I was in Iraq in 2006 with Morgan Luttrell, now my friend in Congress, and we lost people there, and we lost one guy on our last day in country. And then we lost another guy from that same operation 3 months ago to suicide. I'm the last guy who wants to commit U.S. troops overseas. But I'm dang sure willing to help other nations defend themselves against tyranny and evil the way that the Ukrainians have. I don't want to go into any other wars. I spent most of my time in my career involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. So people need to understand that I want to help them out without committing U.S. troops. And they've done a great deal of damage to the Russian army over the last year and a half.
My last question on this topic is, what do you make of former President Trump's comments that he could end it in 24 hours? Is that possible?
I certainly don't advise President Trump, but I don't know how you do that. I don't know what his goal would be. But I think that I see the Crimea as the Sudetenland. If you'll recall, in 1938, Munich, the British gave part of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland, to the Germans to prevent further war. At some point, these folks don't understand anything other than force, and I'd like to see Ukraine restored to its pre-2014 borders, because that's what's internationally recognized. So if you think you can finish it in 24 hours, I'm not sure how you can do that. He's been known to say some things that would indicate some strength where he may or may not have it. I don't know. He may have that relationship with those two leaders to end it in 24 hours to restore the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine, but I don't know.
Our full interview with Congressman Ellzey is on our website, cbstexas.com. Coming up, our interview with former Texas Secretary of State John Scott, who just wrapped up a short stint as interim Texas Attorney General. Former Texas Secretary of State John Scott just completed his job as interim Texas Attorney General. We spoke with him about what the office was like when he arrived, plus we also discussed elections in the state of Texas. Former Texas Secretary of State and former interim Texas Attorney General John Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Jack, it's a pleasure to be with you.
So I wanted to start by asking you about your time as interim Attorney General. I think a lot of people were surprised when the governor announced you would be leaving the post after such a short stay. So talk to us about the timing of it all.
Well, they probably weren't a part of the original conversations that I had with the governor that I would be willing to do it for a very short period of time. And really with the thought that this would be something, and I think the founders probably envisioned that it would be something, the impeachment process would be handled fairly quickly. And so that something in a 30-day time frame, if it went a little longer, that's okay. But then it became very clear that it was going to be way past 30 days. And so that was when we went back to the original representations or understanding that I would be there in a very short period of time and go back to my private practice. And so that ended up extending to 6 weeks, which is much better than going the full time through September, which this thing will end up being at a minimum.
And when you got the call from the governor, why did he come? Why did he pick you?
You'd have to talk to him. I've known him a long time and worked for him in a variety of roles, and have always tried to do kind of what I thought was in the best interest of the state, which is what our governor wants people that work for him to do.
And what was the mission? What did he want you to do as interim Attorney General, and what was your takeaway and what your role really was going to be?
Yeah, he didn't put any barriers on what I was supposed to do over there. The goal, though, was to go over and hopefully bring a sense of calm to the folks there at the Attorney General's office, many of whom I worked with when I was there with the governor when he was Attorney General, to really calm nerves, get people back on mission, which is defending the state, defending the laws of the state, and hopefully stem the tide on people that were thinking they needed to leave or move on to another position that seemed like it may have a little more surety in the future than what the current situation was at the time.
Well, how nervous were people? I mean, were people leaving?
Well, they had lost a number of people had gone over to work on for General Paxton, about 6 really high-ranking people who had done an enormous amount of work product. There were stories that there were another 9 that were fixing to leave as well to maybe do the same thing. There were people who had given pause and said we were reconsidering coming to work at the AG's office. So there were a lot of losses, and I was really worried about maybe a death spiral situation where you had a lot of people exiting the place, but you also at the same time had the inability to hire people back and reload the system full of qualified folks. And that's, what I would envision being a death spiral for the agency. And we were able to calm it, and it's back, I guess, to use the metaphor of a plane, it's trimmed out and it's back running a regular process right now.
And so were you able to convince, everyone who was thinking or, thinking about leaving or thinking about, not coming after saying they would to the office? I mean, did you change everybody's minds?
I don't know if we get 100%, but I think the vast majority of the people felt a little sense of surety. I think it was important for the folks at the Attorney General's office to know that the rest of the state government was 100% behind them and supportive of them. And we wanted to make sure that they knew from everyone that had worked over there that we love the place and we love their mission and we want to be supportive and there for them in anything they need. And the Attorney Generals come and go. I mean, General Abbott, General Cornyn, General Morales, General Maddox. I mean, you can go back in time. They've all come and gone. And the place is managed to do a great job, irrespective of who the leadership is. And it will continue to do that.
And was there anything in your time there that, aside from trying to maintain a sense of calm or restore a sense of calm, what else were you able to accomplish? What was, what are some of the things that you did while you were there?
Well, so we filed some lawsuits. We wanted to make sure that we kept the message that we were still going to be engaged in litigation that we thought was in the best interest of the citizens of the state of Texas. And so if that meant we needed to file suit against the administration, the Biden administration, then so be it. We would do that. And we did a couple of those cases. We got those on the way. We looked at some of the processes over there, like crime victims, and started engaging in ways to try and be more efficient, because the purpose of these programs, like with crime victims, is to write a check to people. So let's find out a better, more efficient way to get those checks written to folks in the most expeditious way possible. So those were a lot of the stuff that went on there are ad hoc. It was everything dealing with the impeachment, getting subpoenas from the House Investigative Committee, to the normal thing of hearing that a statute is going to be challenged by folks, whether it was Harris County or Houston or San Antonio, and prepping up the trial teams, the Solicitor General's office, and making sure that they were in a position to be able to go defend effectively those kind of cases.
And let me just ask you, the fact that, when you left, and this new interim attorney general is in there, how did you leave it with folks? How did you leave the office?
Oh, I think I left very well. I made some new friends of some folks I'd not had the pleasure of working with in the past. I knew a lot of the people over there. Just a lot of my practice deals with the Attorney General's office. It deals with lawsuits involving the state, or had in the past, or claims against companies. So I've always had a close relationship with most of the folks over there that were in leadership positions and at the staff level. And so I had made sure that everyone knew I was there very short term. And I think the governor did as well in his announcement that I was a short-term interim attorney general. And so I think that's one of the big things that, from my perspective, is I tried to make it clear this is not a long-term gig for me, but to make sure that they knew they were getting 100% of me for the 24 hours in each of the days I was lucky enough to serve as attorney general for the state.
So you weren't in the corner office?
No. I had the smallest office I could find on the 8th floor, which had been an intern office, and in fact was the intern office where my oldest son actually did an internship at the AG's office one summer, and was lucky enough to share the same office that he had. It's a little bigger than a closet, but not much.
I wanted to ask you about the fact that the state is leaving ERIC in the next month or so. Talk to me about the importance of ERIC and what it was able to do for the state of Texas, and how concerned should residents be that the state's departure is going to hurt the effort to make sure that there's no fraud going on?
So there's a lot there. Let's unpack it a little bit. And one of the things to focus on is, what are the things that ERIC provided the state of Texas that the state of Texas does not already have access to? And that's really, there's, I think, 26 states and the District of Columbia made up ERIC, were the participants. It's best to think of it almost as a cooperative. Each state paid a little money in for the operational budget, but it was a clearinghouse. And one of the things that it was a clearinghouse of was voter registration and comparing those with the different states. So if there was Jack Fink registered to vote in Dallas, Texas, but Jack Fink was also registered to vote with the same social security number and date of birth in Florida, that would be something that ERIC would notify the states of. And then it would use the information from the Postal Service, from a variety of other sources, information streams, to make sure that those states, both of them, knew that there was somebody who was registered in both states. And most of the time, 99% of the time, that just simply meant that you had moved to Dallas or vice versa. But that was something that ERIC provided as a clearinghouse and was easy, kind of a download. That is really the only thing right now that Texas would not have the ability to do that Eric was providing. So the death records that would come from the Social Security Administration, those come, remember, from each of the counties in Texas. So that each of the 254 counties have a death clerk in that county. Usually it's the county clerk. They send on a weekly basis a tape up to the state of Texas to give a notification of who has passed away in their counties. So the Secretary of State's office already gets that stream of information that comes into them. That's simple. We've also got something within the state of Texas that confirms when somebody moves from one county to another county to know that they can't be registered in both counties. And so we've got a system in place already for that. So again, the only thing that we're going to lose is probably the efficiency, the convenience of Eric having someone else do a lot of that background work.
Isn't that important though?
Oh, sure, but it's not going to stop. It's going to continue to go on. That's something that will be done on a real-time basis by the Secretary of State's office. It's just simply not going to be going through Eric. It's going to be done by state officials.
And isn't that much harder though to accomplish for the state?
I think it's a different path. Remember, there's been 8 other states that have pulled out of Eric. And I think that's one of the things that we have to look at as well, as kind of when we talk about the cross-state kind of connection. I think that's one of the things that is probably reduced in time. Look, is it efficient? Has it worked? Yes. But it's a policy decision to have joined it. It's a policy decision to pull out. And that was the policy decision of the legislature to pull out.
And when you were Secretary of State, you were still Secretary of State, if I'm not mistaken, when the law, well, no, you weren't, because this happened after you left.
Yes.
The lawmakers passed, but were you ever asked about this before you left, as far as would this be a good idea? And if the state were to leave Eric, what would the state need to do to replace it?
So the state would need to build up an infrastructure to process those information streams and be able to make sure that each of the counties had updated and accurate voter registration list. So that's something that has to be replaced. The counties, the election administrators or the county clerks, whoever is in charge of those voter registrations at the county level, there's an enormous amount of communication that has always gone on. And so one of the downsides, obviously, is you lose the clearinghouse, maybe the efficiency of a cooperative that's doing that process, but you may gain some knowledge and wisdom in the processing of that same information as a state that you don't necessarily get when someone else is doing the work for you. So it's way too early to know whether, in fact, this is going to be long-term net positive or net negative. They've provided funds, they've provided FTEs, is my understanding, the full-time equivalent employees, for the Secretary of State's office to fill those positions and to cover the cost associated with managing that information so that it can get back to the counties to ensure that those voter registration rolls remain accurate.
And will this be placed in time, do you think, before the March 1st primary?
I would think so. I mean, so many of these things, remember, it's a 90-day window. So the state of Texas still is a part of Eric. It's my understanding they've been setting up that system throughout the process of the legislative process over at the Secretary of State's office. So I have full confidence they will have something up and running that manages those systems quite well by the time the March primaries come.
And I just had another couple of questions, and I appreciate your time. When you were Secretary of State, you oversaw the 2020 audits, the audits of the 2020 election in the top counties of our state, including 3 here in North Texas, Dallas, Tarrant, and Collin counties. And did you find any widespread fraud or serious problems in our counties at all?
I don't think there was any widespread fraud in anything that we developed. We did it's almost 300, almost 400 page long audit report, and recommend anybody that is interested about elections read it. It's available at the Secretary of State's website. And the governor identified the largest 2 Republican counties, the largest 2 population Democrat counties. And that was the goal, was to go over and see what went on. what we learned were a lot of best practices. And, you saw a place like Collin County that runs its elections exceptionally well. Tarrant County did an exceptional job. Dallas County had some hiccups, but so did Tarrant. And then Harris County, they probably got more like a C or D on their report card, which is not unusual because it's the largest county by far in our state. And the one wild card in elections is people and the human factor in running elections.
And they are subject to the 2022 audit now. How did that happen?
So we had a drawing. We put 30 of the largest 30 populations, which the statute required, and we decided to just have a drawing, just like we do to determine like constitutional, the location of a constitutional amendment on that election that you'll see in November. It's a random drawing. So we put those 30 names of the counties in a bucket, and we had somebody come over that was in the office, and we put it on Facebook Live, and it was filmed, and they drew the picture. They drew the counties out, and Harris County and Cameron County were the two large counties selected. And then we selected 2 of the smaller counties out of the remaining 224 counties.
And I know you're not in office now at the Secretary of State's, but there's been some criticism about the current 2022 audit not being done yet. How do you expect that to be all resolved?
So the enormity of the effort that goes into the audit is really not necessarily fully appreciated. I know that some of the criticism has come from Harris County folks that are connected to they have some election contests that have evolved out of that 22 election. My big takeaway is there's nothing that they would find in an audit that they would not be able to get through discovery in the lawsuits that they're involved in. So I don't think it's a fair criticism. I think given the enormity of the effort, I think that, wait till the report comes out before anyone wants to throw rocks at someone like Senator Nelson or Secretary Nelson.
Former Secretary of State and former interim Texas AG, John Scott, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Jack, thank you. It's always great to be with you.
Likewise. Thank you, sir. That's all for Eye on Politics this week. I'm Jack Fink. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. You're watching CBS News Texas.